So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today on this lovely day. I think this is going to be a very interesting and incredibly timely presentation. And I want everyone to realize that BCTV is going to be filming for later broadcast, and we're very happy that they could do this today. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dante Scala. Dante is a professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire. He has been an observer of New Hampshire politics for more than 2 decades, and he has written 2 books on the Granite State and the presidential nomination process, as well as numerous shorter works. Without further ado, our speaker for today.
Thank you. Each time I get introduced, that number of years I've been here ticks upward. Thanks for the introduction. It's nice to be here today to talk to you about the New Hampshire primary, and it's especially timely given everything that's going on about the primary, and I'll talk about that toward the end, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. So I plan to present for about 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then we'll have some time for questions and so forth if you have them about New Hampshire or about the primary or politics in general, whatever you like. What I'm here to talk about today is kind of like the why and how we got to where we are today, where we're in this situation where New Hampshire has this prize, so to speak, right, the first in the nation primary. And the question is, how did we come by this over the years? And it's a long and somewhat convoluted story, and it's very much an accidental story. It's not a story that suggests there was a lot of planning for how we got to where we are, though there has been a lot of planning to keep what we have. And so what I'll do is kind of interweave the story of New Hampshire with the story of the nomination process itself and how that's evolved over the past 200 years. And that also is a very accidental story which has taken a lot of twists and turns over the decades. So the history of the presidential nomination process itself basically goes through 4 periods, in each of which a different vehicle has been used to choose presidential nominees. And when I'm talking about nominees, I'm going to be talking about nominees of the major parties. But there's one trend that goes through this thread, which extends all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. And that is that there would be a process put into place, flaws would be discovered in that process, or it would be a process that worked for a while but then stopped working. And then the major parties, Democrats, Republicans, would come up with a new process. But in each time, they would say, okay, this process has certain problems. And always the answer to the problems, the solution was, let's make the process more democratic. And I mean that with a small d, not a capital D. Okay, so every time kind of more democratic, more transparent. Okay, so that was basically more publicly available to see exactly what was happening. Okay. So if we go all the way back to 1800, okay, the first process put into place for nominating presidential candidates was known as the Congressional Caucus. Okay, and that starts basically, it's on the right here, it's like basically the time period that I'm talking about. And it lasts just a quarter century, okay, from 1800 to 1824. And as I mentioned Thomas Jefferson, it was Thomas Jefferson's party, political party, that created this process. And Jefferson's this really interesting figure when it comes to political parties in general. When he was basically the first leader of an opposition party, right? Because in the 1790s you have the Federalist Party, right? The party of Washington, the party of Hamilton, and so forth. And Jefferson, even though he serves as Washington's Secretary of State, ultimately becomes the leader of the opposition party, which was ultimately known as the Democratic Republicans. Ultimately it graduates to Andrew Jackson and becomes the Democratic Party. But Jefferson leads the opposition and ultimately becomes the first candidate elected from the opposition party in 1800 against John Adams. Right? And Jefferson's, one of the things he's very well known for is his inaugural speech, where he basically tries to heal the wounds of the 1800 presidential election, which was very, I mean, you think 2020 was bad, and it was, right? But 1800 was in some ways equally, if not worse, because it was the first time the United States had gone through a contested election, right? Prior to this, it was basically Washington by acclamation. And so it was the first time we had two parties fighting over the presidency, and it then, like now, seemed to be on the verge of tearing the country apart. So Jefferson, in his inaugural address, gives this speech about how, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, basically to kind of say, look, I'm going to be president of the entire country, not just my party. Interestingly, Jefferson saw his party as just something temporary. Like, he didn't think a lot of the founding era, Washington, Jefferson, et cetera, one, they thought political parties were very suspicious. And you may hold those suspicions as well. But that political parties are not good for democracy because they divide people go into factions, et cetera. But Jefferson, nonetheless, said, well, I need to lead this opposition party because I think Washington and Hamilton, Adams are leading the country on the wrong path. I need to put the country back on the right path, and they were fighting over things like whether we should have a national bank and those sorts of things, whether the country's too centralized or not. And Jefferson saw his party as a temporary remedy, and that we would, once Jefferson was able to get into the presidency, set the nation straight, then his party could disappear and we could go forward united. Now that didn't happen. But Jefferson, even though he didn't like political parties, he actually turned out to be a very effective partisan. He was very good, for example, at guiding his party's members of Congress to get legislation passed. So he was a very effective president in terms of legislation, and that was because he knew how to use his party without them feeling used, right? Like Jefferson was happy to take a back seat on things. Like he wasn't always wanting to put himself first and foremost. He was happy to guide through back channels to get legislation passed by his party. Another thing another invention during Jefferson's era, what was known as a caucus. And that was basic, and then we have caucuses now in today's Congress. And that basically a caucus is a meeting of all the members of the same political party who are members of Congress, okay? So in Jefferson's day, all the Democratic Republican members of Congress would get together and have meetings. And meetings would be a way then as now for everyone in the party to get on the same page when it came to things like legislation. What Jefferson's party used a caucus for, among other things, was to choose presidential nominees. Okay? So when it came time to choose the nominee of the party, they would get together, this very small, elite group of people, really. Okay? I mean, basically, it's like the members of Congress of Jefferson's party in a room like this one. Okay? And they would decide who the nominee was going to be. Okay? You know, in today's world, it would be as if, in 2024, right, Republicans are going to have a contest for the nomination. Imagine if it were the case that Kevin McCarthy, right, Mitch McConnell, and all the members of the Republican Party who are members of Congress got together in a room and stayed there until they chose the nominee of their party. Now that seems just like, from another planet today, but, perhaps if you're a Republican, you might see certain advantages in doing just that, rather than the process we have today. Now, it wouldn't be very democratic with a small d, okay? On the other hand, arguably it would save a lot of time. It would save a lot of expense. And if you didn't especially like the nominee of the Republican Party in 2016 and 2020, probably if McCarthy and his colleagues got in a room, they wouldn't choose someone like that for 2024. Maybe they would, but perhaps they would choose someone more like them, an established politician, so forth and so on. Okay? So this was the system for the first quarter century. Okay? And again, American democracy was not then what it is now, right? I mean, we really didn't have a mass democracy until later in the 19th century. But essentially, elites got together. They chose the nominee of their party. It was easy for a caucus to get together, right? They were all in one place in the nation's capital, so it was easy. Transportation, communication weren't issues. Okay? But that's for the first quarter century. And New Hampshire really has nothing to do with this part of the story, right? There are no primaries yet. That's a long way down the road. Then we graduate or progress to another system. And by progress, I mean, again, the process becomes more democratic with a small d. It's opened up to more people to participate, and it becomes more transparent. Okay? And this is what's known as the pure convention system. And it lasts, well, really, it's the longest lasting period of the nomination process that I'm going to talk about. Like, it's longer than the one we've been in now. Our current day system has lasted from 1972 until now. So we're going on half a century, basically. But this lasted 3/4 of a century. And who knows, it may hold the record. Maybe at some point we'll decide to change our system of nominating and try something else. But what happens in 1824 is that the caucus system falls apart. And the reason for that is that Jefferson's party is a victim of its own success. Okay? Jefferson and his fellow partisans were too good at their job. And basically, I mean, it's striking how the Federalist Party, which is the party of George Washington, the party of John Adams, the party of Alexander Hamilton, basically is relegated to minority status and then disappears entirely right before the first half of the 19th century is over. Okay? Basically, the Federalist Party becomes so unpopular, it's reduced to the party of New England. And political parties, as I often remind my students, is they're only there to win elections. Okay? Political parties aren't debating societies, right? They're not there to they hash out issues and take positions and all those and have platforms. All that's true. But if political parties don't win elections, okay, they wither and they die, or they barely hang on to life, like, say, the Libertarian Party, right? Parties are there to win elections, period. And so what happens is Jefferson's party basically converts the United States to a one-party system. And as a result, if you've ever been part of a political party, one of the things they try to emphasize is party discipline. Like, okay, we're all Republicans here, we vote for the Republican candidate. And even if we don't like him or her, we still vote Republican because we're Republicans. So discipline is always one of the things that hangs a party together. Well, what happens when you have a one-party system? And you're going to win before the election starts? Well, discipline starts to get a little lax. Like, well, we don't really need to have one nominee necessarily. And so what happens is the caucus chooses a nominee in 24, but then everyone kind of goes their separate ways. And we wind up with several different presidential candidates. And it winds up being, John Quincy Adams, right? John Adams' son becomes the president eventually. Andrew Jackson runs, gets more votes, more popular votes than Adams, but because there are multiple candidates, no one gets a majority in the Electoral College. Adams and Henry Clay, right, another famous figure from the 19th century, they kind of come up with some sort of deal that Adams is able to win in the House of Representatives, right, which is where the disputed elections go when no one gets a majority of the Electoral College votes. Jackson cries foul. He says this was basically a rigged election. Sounds familiar, right? Trump wasn't the first to come up with that. But Jackson, I mean, it did run, the 1824 election did run by the rules of the day. So it wasn't, Adams didn't do anything unconstitutional, but Jackson had a reason to cry foul, right? He did get more votes than, at least more popular votes than Adams did. Long story short, right, Jackson basically runs in 1828, runs in the next election, beats Adams the next time. But Jackson and the Democrats decide to junk, basically one of the byproducts of all this tumult and chaos is the caucus system goes away. And Jackson and the Democrats replace this with a convention, which is essentially another type of national party meeting, like the caucus, but it's opened up to more people than just the members of Congress. Okay. What would happen at a convention, and then, now again, the conventions are still held now, right? We can, in 2024, there will be a Democratic Party convention and a Republican Party convention and so forth. And then as now, delegations will arrive from the various states, okay? And state parties then as now send groups depending on the size of the state and so forth. California will have a bigger delegation than New Hampshire, so forth and so on. All that's the same. However, at the time, conventions actually mattered in a way they don't today. Today, they're more, some party business gets done at national party conventions, that's true. But nominees aren't chosen at conventions the way they were back then. Now, I've got my own, I've been a political scientist, a fully accredited licensed political scientist for 20 odd years now. I've seen a lot of things. I've seen a couple of impeachments, right? I've seen, but I've never seen a contested party convention. So every 4 years they get my hopes up, right? Because the media has never seen one of these two, unless they're, no one working today has seen one. So they always like, well, what if this happens or that happens? And we got pretty close with Obama and Clinton back in 2008, but we haven't seen one of these where actually like the convention floor, right? People are choosing up sides and trying to win over delegates and so forth. We had, 76, Ford and Reagan probably was the closest we've gotten to that in this era, but back then it was the norm. And it was state party leaders or so-called party bosses, okay? Like think about Ray Buckley, right? The head of the New Hampshire Democrats today, right? Ray Buckley's equivalent back then would have been known as a party boss. But the party boss back then was a lot more powerful than Ray Buckley is today. No offense to Mr. Buckley. The same could be said about the Republican leadership today. Because these party leaders, basically, they would haggle, okay? They would come in and they would bargain with the other party chiefs from around the country over whom the nominee should be. And they would base that on a number of factors, right? They would think about things like electability then as now, but they would also think about regional things. Like they would think about, okay, we need, in the 19th century, it might be, well, we need a northerner and a southerner on the ticket, right? We need regional balance. Might be something like that. But they would basically haggle and go back and forth, and people would have all these interesting tricks, like put maybe the Illinois delegation would put up the governor of Illinois as a so-called favorite son. And so everyone from Illinois would vote for the governor of Illinois on the first ballot on the convention floor. And that would be based, but no one really thought the governor would be the ultimate nominee, but he was basically a placeholder. While the party chief of Illinois would haggle, in those infamous back rooms allegedly filled with cigar smoke and so forth, right? It was a different era in a lot of ways. And so this would be kind of a fascinating thing to watch. But if you were a delegate to these conventions, now technically, you were in charge, right? You cast votes for who the nominee would be. But in practice, again, remember party discipline. Okay, if you were a delegate to a party convention in the 19th century, the only reason you were a delegate was because you were a loyal party member. And to be loyal back in the day meant you followed, it was very hierarchical. you followed what the party boss said. Right? And in return, right, the party boss might do you favors at some point down the road. So everything was party chiefs kind of held the upper hand. And they would haggle and so forth and so on. And this is how things worked. And ultimately, then as now, the candidate with a majority of delegates would become the nominee. Okay? Democrats actually made it a supermajority to become the nominee of the party. Okay? So all that happened. But at this point, right, no primaries. That's a distant vision at this point. Now, what about New Hampshire? Well, interestingly, I've been doing some work on a book chapter someone asked me to write on New England politics. And so I've been looking at some work done by other scholars who are more, I'm a political scientist, not a historian. So I've been relying on work that's done by, say, if you ever want to read something on New Hampshire primary, on the history, Charles Brereton wrote, deceased now, wrote a number of works on the history of the primary. But let's think about town meeting. Okay, that's very much a New England tradition, a New Hampshire tradition, right? One of the oldest version, maybe the oldest version of direct democracy we have in the United States, dates back to the 1620s and so forth. Well, what does that have to do with presidential nomination politics? Not a lot, but bear with me. You've heard the term straw poll. These are things that are often taken, they're kind of unofficial tallies, right? Like, let's say the Bedford Democrats get together and it's a presidential primary year. And they get together at a meeting one Saturday afternoon and they decide we're going to have a straw poll. And all the Bedford Democrats are going to vote on different presidential candidates, and we're going to publicize the results. Let's say there's, 250 people there, and they publicize the results, and it's a presidential primary year, and the national media has nothing better to do. So they show up in Bedford, and they look at the results, and the Washington Post writes a story about it saying, look, Bedford Democrat, look, there's this groundswell of support for so-and-so to be president because there's a straw poll. Right now, again, straw polls don't count for anything. And if you're a politically experienced person, there's any number of ways to manipulate straw polls. Like Iowa used to have a straw poll. Remember, this is back a couple decades now. In the summer, before the Iowa caucuses, Iowa Republicans would come out someday in July or August in Iowa, and they would vote in this straw poll. And it didn't mean anything, but it was seen as, because the media covered it, it actually counted for something. And so campaigns would spend all this money on this meaningless thing to try to prove to the national media that there was support for their campaign. So if you think back to, say, 2000, Republicans, like a number of candidates basically tried and failed and then got out of town because of this Iowa straw poll. They don't do it anymore, but well, until 1878, interestingly, New Hampshire on town meeting day, right, the second Tuesday in March, they also held their state elections on the same day. Okay? And now again, it's back in the 19th century, so they kind of got a 2-for-1. They did town meeting, but they also held state elections. And the national media would cover this March election because they saw it as an early barometer of public opinion. Well, okay, here's how New Hampshire voted. Maybe this gives us a sense of which way the national winds are blowing, right? Sound familiar? I mean, this is kind of like why is the New Hampshire primary important? Well, because it shows this initial barometer of how the public might feel about, say, an incumbent president and so forth, okay? So that was going on, and it has nothing to do with presidential nomination politics, but it was kind of an early precursor of what we wound up with eventually. And it was this formula for success for New Hampshire. Okay, now we go forward to this now we're in third period of presidential nomination politics. And this is a bit of a mess. And it's called a mixed system because we really don't have a better term for it. But essentially, remember the turn of the 20th century we have this movement in national politics known as the progressive era, okay? Now, progressive politics, we think about it today, we think about, Bernie Sanders, right, and AOC. We think of it as something that the left wing of the Democratic Party does. Back then, it was really more of a, if anything, more of a Republican thing than a Democratic thing. Like Teddy Roosevelt would have classified himself as a progressive Republican. And one of the things progressives basically looked at American politics after decades of political parties and party bosses and so forth. And they said, this whole thing is corrupt. Here are all these party bosses calling the shots, telling politicians what to do. And what are they interested in? They don't care about the good of the country. They care about things like, the spoils of victory. The more elections you win, the more jobs you have to hand out to your political allies. They care about stuff, stuff like that. They don't care about the general good. So the thing to do is to if you get rid of the party bosses and you basically pull their teeth, they then will have a system that is better oriented toward promoting the public good and less corrupt. So one of the things progressives try to do is end the power of the party bosses. So how do you do that? Well, you take away their nominating powers, okay? And once again, you democratize things, okay? The solution always is, right, democratize the process. So some states, including New Hampshire, start to hold primaries to select party nominees for office and take the power out of the hands of the elites. Now we've gone from a congressional caucus to party bosses, and now we're putting power in the hands of just ordinary members of the parties. Now, again, I mentioned this is a mixed system. So a number of states, including New Hampshire, choose primaries as their vehicle for nominating candidates. Not just presidential candidates, but candidates of all types for all sorts of offices. But not like a lot of reforms in American politics, they're half-baked reforms. In other words, it's a big country, it's tough to get, it's a country that's based on federalism, so states have a lot of power. So it's tough to get a reform to stick across the country. And that's what happens with this, is that some states decide to hold primaries, but not enough to change the equation. In other words, if you're a candidate for the presidency, you look at these primaries and you say to yourself, okay, can I win the nomination of my party just by competing in primaries? And the answer to that was no. There aren't enough delegates awarded by states that hold primaries. States where party bosses are still in charge still hold enough delegates to be the ones who ultimately decide. And so some states, so we have this system, lasts about half a century, right, where some states hold primaries but not enough, and party bosses are still in charge. And basically, what we wind up having is, you can kind of think about primaries as horse races. I don't know if anyone follows horse racing. I follow sports, but not horse racing very much. But this idea that, like, if you own a horse, right, a 2-year-old, let's say, and you think, well, this horse has possibilities. Like this horse could actually run in the Derby, let's say, or the Belmont Stakes. So what do? Well, you run the horse in a couple of other races to see how it does. Okay? And if the horse is good enough, maybe you get backing from wealthy people and you run your horse in the Derby. Well, that's how primaries worked for candidates back in the 20th century. So let's say, I don't know, you're John F. Kennedy. Okay? You seem to have a lot of things going for you, at least on paper, right? You're young, you're handsome, you're charismatic. There's a lot of good things seem to be going your way. However, you haven't proved yourself yet. Okay? For one thing, you're a Roman Catholic. Okay? You've never been, no one from your faith has been elected president. So what do? I mean, so you have a lot to prove, in other words. You know, party bosses look at you, but they've got other choices. They could put Lyndon Johnson in the presidency. They could put Hubert Humphrey in the presidency. So how, if you're Kennedy, do you prove yourself? Well, you enter a few primaries, and they're basically the equivalent of horse races, okay? So if you're Kennedy, right, you're a Catholic, okay, you won New Hampshire, but that isn't really, okay, it's your backyard. That doesn't really prove much to a party boss. But you run in West Virginia, right, you say, oh, well, that's a different story. If Kennedy, a Roman Catholic from New England of all places, can win in West Virginia, well, that might prove that he really could be a national candidate. So he does, and he wins, right? And this proves to party bosses to get behind him that Kennedy could actually win a national election. That's what primaries were used for back then, okay? Because there just weren't enough delegates. Okay? Now, here, finally, we get to the dawn of the New Hampshire primary, okay? And the year to keep in mind, one year to keep in mind is 1916. Now, New Hampshire, in the whole scheme of things, wasn't like in the vanguard of progressivism in the early 20th century. Like it wasn't Wisconsin, you know, or something like that. However, there was enough progressivism, and again, it happened within the Republican Party that all this took place. There was a rebellion within the New Hampshire Republican Party over the influence of corporations, okay, or you know, in particular, a railroad, the Boston and Maine Railroad. And this was a railroad that had, now I'm not, I say corporations, I'm not sure, strictly speaking, if it had a corporate structure, but it was this kind of large economic interest, okay? And because it was a large economic interest, it had a lot of kind of political tentacles. And one of the things it used, for example, to control the party, which held conventions to nominate candidates, was known as a proxy. So, you know, proxy voting is like, you know, my department at UNH uses these. Like if I can't be at a meeting, I give my proxy to a colleague and they'll vote my vote for me, right? Well, proxies were used back then, you know, could be used at conventions. However, what would happen is the Boston and Maine Railroad would basically trade favors for proxies. So, you know, you're going to the convention, you have a vote, well, I'll do this for you, and you give me, you know, the agent of the railroad, let's say, the proxy, so that I can vote the way the railroad wants me to. So there's this rebellion within the Republican Party, and which leads to, in 1909, New Hampshire creating its own direct primary law. Okay, so here we go, we have a primary now, but it's not a presidential primary yet. Okay, that doesn't happen until 1913, when New Hampshire extends the vehicle of the primary to cover presidential nominees. Okay, so it's a process that takes a couple of cycles, and we don't actually hold a presidential primary until 1916. Okay, so just about a century ago. However, interestingly, we're not first, at least not right away. Okay? Okay. Actually, the first time we hold the second primary. It's a week after Indiana, and it's the same day as Minnesota. Okay, so we're not first in the nation, so to speak, until 4 years later in 1920. Now you might say, why? You know, was there a big struggle? You know, did we fight it out with Indiana and Minnesota? Was there a big struggle and so forth? No, not really. I mean, one, the reason we were up as high as we were in the first place, I mean, second's pretty close to first, right? Did they do that because they thought one day, you know, there would be national media entourage following candidates around in New Hampshire and we'd become the center of the political universe? No, we just did it because we, you know, for the same reason that I, after living 20 years in New Hampshire, always go around and turn down all the thermostats, right? It's just like this simple Yankee frugality. And we wanted to save money by holding the primary on the same day as town meeting. So we'd get a 2-for-1. So we moved it up a couple of months from, say, May to March. And it just so happened that that put us second. Okay, not for any far-sighted reason. It was kind of like this penny-wise decision. But as it turned out, okay, 4 years later, Minnesota just dropped its primary entirely. Like it just ceased having one, okay? And Indiana bumped theirs back to May. And presto, okay? New Hampshire becomes the first in the nation primary, okay? I mean, you look back in retrospect, Minnesota, good grief, what were you thinking, Minnesota? Well, keep in mind at the time, it really didn't matter who went first, okay? National media weren't covering these events, and primaries did not decide nominees. And so being first just didn't seem to register that it would ever matter that much. It certainly didn't matter back then. So essentially, New Hampshire was like, all of a sudden, it's like you come into inheritance of a piece of property, right? And the piece of property isn't worth much to anyone or to you, but you hold on to it. And then suddenly something changes, right, in the surrounding area. And all of a sudden your piece of property becomes incredibly valuable. Like someone changes the course of a river or something like that, and all of a sudden you've got beachfront property. That's kind of what happened to New Hampshire, okay? But for 3 decades, no one cared. New Hampshire voted first, and no one really cared very much. Why? Well, one reason why was voters were not directly choosing candidates. So if you went and voted in the Republican primary from 1920 to 1948, you weren't going and voting for a candidate. You were going and voting for a delegate, okay, on a list of delegates who was likely as not one of the party elites, okay, local party elite. And that party elite might say, well, okay, I'm going to go vote for so-and-so if you vote for me, okay? But, voting for a delegate is not nearly as exciting as voting directly for a candidate. And it's a little difficult to interpret what the results are if you're looking at delegates and so forth. So what happens in time for the 52 primaries, that the New Hampshire legislature adds what is known as a beauty contest. And essentially, they just kind of patched it on to the existing primary system, and they said now voters can vote directly for candidates. Okay? And they were hoping basically to jumpstart the primary because it wasn't really doing much for anybody. Okay? And that was the magic potion, so to speak, right? That was the secret sauce. And in some ways it goes back again to the 19th century, right? With New Hampshire town meeting was an early barometer of national opinion, so the national media paid attention. 52, Republicans want to see, or at least some Republicans want to see how Dwight Eisenhower would poll as a candidate. Everyone thought he had a lot of potential to be a candidate, even though no one knew what party he belonged to. I mean, he was Eisenhower, so it really didn't matter. So Republicans wanted to see how he would do running, and so therefore, they enter him into the New Hampshire primary. Presto, he does really well, right? Wins New Hampshire, and national media pay a lot of attention. They say, look, Eisenhower could be president after all. Now we can see it because New Hampshire voters say he's presidential. Okay? Then we fast forward to 1968, and then we think about on the Democratic side, right? Lyndon Johnson is president. Early on in his first full term, one would think he would be the odds-on choice to run again in 68, but of course we have the Vietnam War and so forth. Johnson becomes an increasingly polarizing figure, especially in his own party. Gene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy decides to pass on running against Johnson, at least initially, but Gene McCarthy, right, senator, steps up, decides to run against Johnson. Johnson doesn't even put his name on the ballot in 68 in New Hampshire, in part because Johnson feels as if it's his nomination. He's the president. Why should he have to run for it, right? Which is not crazy for the time, right? But ultimately, they do a write-in effort for Johnson. Johnson wins the 68 Democratic primary in New Hampshire, but McCarthy does well. And once again, the national media blows this up and says, look, this is an example of Johnson is basically damaged goods. His own party is divided over the war and so forth. And ultimately, as you know, Johnson decides a short time later to get out and not run again. Bobby Kennedy then gets in. So Hubert Humphrey gets in, so forth and so on. But as far as New Hampshire goes, right, 52 and then 68 kind of are the dawn of the New Hampshire primaries being influential in presidential nomination politics. Okay. Now, we get to the current era that we're in. Okay. And essentially, one of the byproducts of this tumultuous year in 1968 is to finish the story of the 68 Democratic nomination process, right? Kennedy gets in, right? He wins the California primary. He's assassinated that evening. Gene McCarthy stays in, keeps running in primaries. Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, declares, but he doesn't run in any primaries. He's going to get the nomination the old-fashioned way, i.e. via the party bosses. So Humphrey and McCarthy show up at the convention. Humphrey's basically got it in the bag, but McCarthy and his people basically cry foul. And they say this whole process is rigged. Not the word they use necessarily, but that was the intent. And basically this is all done by the party bosses, but McCarthy has popular appeal within the party and so forth. And of course, the 68 convention in Chicago is basically chaos outside, right? Police are beating up people and so forth. And inside, it's also chaotic because McCarthy's people are causing an enormous fuss. It's all getting played out on national TV. So the Democratic Party decides to try to heal things. And in order to heal things, they create a commission in 68. And one of the people who leads the commission is a politician from South Dakota named George McGovern. Okay? And they create a commission to re-examine the nomination process in time for 72. Okay? And unlike a lot of commissions, this one actually gets something done. Okay? Starting in 72, basically we have a process that becomes much more democratic with a small d and a capital D, and then much more transparent. And it's a system that the Democrats push, and basically the Republicans kind of tag along on this. And they make their process more democratic, more transparent. Party bosses really no longer matter at this point in the nomination process. And conventions, as I mentioned earlier, almost never matter. Okay, in terms of determining the nominee of their party. Okay? Instead, if you're a prospective candidate, your calculus has changed. Now, unlike the mixed system, now you can win the nomination without having to court a single party boss. That's the good news, I guess. The bad news is that now you basically have to run the equivalent of 2 national campaigns to be president. You have to run the general election campaign against the candidate of the opposing party. But before you get there, you've got to run your own campaign to win delegates in primaries and caucuses, depending on the state. You win primaries in order to accumulate delegates, and the person who gets a majority of delegates to the convention wins the nomination. But now you've basically got to run this really exhausting gauntlet. Right, this obstacle, long run out, you have to do it once, and then you have to do it again. But the first time you have to do it basically by yourself without the formal support of the party, because you are running against other members of the party for this nomination. And that's been the system really for the last half century, with a few wrinkles here and there. Like you might remember, Democrats created superdelegates, right? And the Bernie Sanders people raised an enormous fuss about this and so on. So there have been little wrinkles, but this is basically the rules of the game. We haven't had a situation where the party has overruled the decision of rank and file party voters. Okay, we haven't had, you think about Donald Trump, right? Pretty controversial Republican candidate in 2016, including for a lot of Republicans. And there was a lot of talk that, oh wait, at the convention, let's see what happens. Party elites could change things, et cetera, et cetera. But it all came to naught, okay? Because party elites are really reluctant to overturn someone who has exhibited popular support among the party base, or at least more support than anyone else has. All right, so now, basically for the last half century, every 4 years for a week, it's like a solar eclipse or something. Like, it's a long time coming, but like once for 1 week, every 4 years, we become the center of the political universe. I've been here for about half of that. It's for me, it's an enormous amount of fun. My mom likes watching me on TV from New Jersey and so forth and so on. But it's unbelievable. Like this, you go downtown Manchester, you walk up and down the street, and you bump into national media figures, blah 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 blah. But what's interesting is basically we can think about, we've substituted, like I've talked about the party bosses a lot, right? Basically, we've substituted one set of gatekeepers, so to speak, right? Party bosses said, this is an electable candidate, this is not an electable candidate. Well, now we have a new set of people doing that, basically, right? Party bosses are out, but the media, right? Like, again, New Hampshire has had this long-term relationship with the national political media dating back decades and decades, but the national media has always seen as basically put itself in the place of party bosses, right? I mean, if you've been reading the newspaper this morning about Biden's State of the Union, what are you getting from the media? Saying, oh, look, Joe looks good. Look at him giving it to Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? He looks vigorous. He looks like he could run again, and so forth, right? So the media is basically rethinking how they look at Joe Biden, right? I mean, they're basically acting as gatekeepers. Like, is Biden a legitimate nominee as a, 82-year-old in 2024? Media has a lot to do with that, right? And they kind of set, they talk on TV and blah, 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 and then we think about what they have to say about it. So the media and activists are in, right? That if you've heard that kind of low wailing sound for the past few months, those are Democratic activists in New Hampshire thinking about what they may well be about to lose, right? Because activists have an enormous amount to say about who the nominee is going to be of their party, right? More party bosses are out, but activists are in, right? I mean, in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, they're courted and so forth. They have pictures taken with them. They have access to candidates and so forth. That's all part, in a political party, right? You have your formal structure, and then you have your activists who are very, involved in the party, and then you have your rank and file voters. But activists mean a lot in the process. They're looked at, does this candidate have the support of activists? Do they have endorsements? So forth and so on. And wealthy donors, right, have become a big deal over the last half century, right? So in some ways, you're trading one set of elites for another. Because imagine if you're a candidate and you're not self-funding, well, you've got to raise money a little bit at a time, from a lot of wealthy people, okay? That's, people ask me a lot, what's Chris Sununu going to do? Is he going to run for office? And so forth and so on. And I always reply, Governor Sununu is, very good on television talking about running for president. Okay? My mom down in New Jersey, big fan. That's all I ever hear about anymore. She's like he's her adopted son. She's like, oh, Chris Sununu, have you seen Chris Sununu? He's great. But I don't know. Like, one thing I wonder about is Governor Sununu willing to spend, every day on the phone, talking to wealthy donors, chatting them up to get more money, right? That's not so much fun as being on CNN kind of talking about New Hampshire, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, New Hampshire, as I said, right, has had this place, just like it did in the 19th century, but much more so, right, as a center of national attention, as an early barometer of the national political mood, right? And we've done this again and again and again. Like in '76, we did it with Jimmy Carter, right? In '92, we did it with Bill Clinton, but also with Patrick Buchanan as this kind of signal that, oh, all's not well in the Republican Party and their relationship with George Herbert Walker Bush, right? We did it with John McCain, so forth and so on. We've often, we haven't always been great at picking winners, right? Ask Bernie Sanders. But we're awfully good at we've been awfully good at putting people, making them the center of attention, often as the alternative to the mainstream candidate. Like John McCain, for example, was so fond of New Hampshire. Why? Because New Hampshire, in large part, put him on the political map. People knew, people knew who John McCain was after New Hampshire in a way they didn't before. Okay? So now, a couple more things. One, how have we protected the primary over the last half century? Well, the chief government officer in charge of that is the Secretary of State, who does a number of things in New Hampshire, like dealing with corporations and so forth. But for our purposes, key thing is he's the chief elections officer for New Hampshire. He's in charge of running elections. It used to be Bill Gardner for a very long time, right? Now it's Doug Scanlon. Doug Scanlon? Dave Scanlon? 1970s, the New Hampshire legislature grants the Secretary of State discretion to move the primary ahead of other states. And this was done in response to a purported threat from other New England states. So this is between basically 72, 72, George McGovern makes a big play here against Ed Muskie. But in the run-up, after that, one of the after effects is other New England states are thinking, hey, maybe we should weigh in, and maybe we shouldn't let New Hampshire have all the glory. And so New Hampshire gears itself like, okay, how can we stay ahead of Massachusetts? Okay, which is a threat that never came to pass, but it seemed like it might. So basically the legislature just says, okay, we need to put this in the hands of one person whose only goal is to make sure New Hampshire stays first, so that they're unsullied, unswayed by partisan reasoning, right? So they give the Secretary of State discretion, and then they follow up on that in 95 by saying, we, the legislature, order you, the New Hampshire Secretary of State, to hold the primary at least 7 days before any other primary. Okay, that was the loophole, so to speak, that allowed the Iowa caucuses to go ahead of the New Hampshire primary, because basically the Secretary of State has always ruled that a caucus is not a primary. Therefore, Iowa can go first and we could go second. Okay, that's why in what apparently is going to happen in 2024, the New Hampshire Secretary of State is bound by law, basically, to move us 7 days ahead of South Carolina, no matter what the National Democratic Party says. And the Secretary of State has no discretion in that. He has discretion as to when he decides to do that, but he ultimately has to do it unless the legislature changes the law, which they're not about to do anytime soon, as far as I can see. Okay? So, not to end on an ominous note, but one thing to keep in mind throughout all this, you might say, well, as I mentioned, I warned you, right? This is going to be a convoluted story full of twists and turns and so forth. And one reason for that is, there's no final authority when push comes to shove over the nomination process. I mean, hypothetically, perhaps Congress could pass a law that governed the nomination process. Maybe. That's a little unclear, but at least to me. But they've never done this. So basically, there's no final authority. So in other words, take again what's happening. The National Democratic Party can't tell the state of New Hampshire when to hold its primary. Okay? They can set their calendar as they see fit, put South Carolina ahead of us, etc. But they can't tell the state of New Hampshire as a legal entity, governmental entity, what to do. Okay? So, on the other hand, the Democratic Party can do other things, like they have control over their delegates. Okay? And the rules over allocating delegates to candidates based on their performance in primaries. And the state of New Hampshire can't do anything about that, right? The state of New Hampshire can't tell the National Democratic Party how to allocate its delegates. So you have a bit of a standoff where the states can control some things, but not everything. Political parties can control some things, but not everything. So, in other words, you could have a situation where, okay, South Carolina is set up to hold its Democratic primary first. New Hampshire comes, the Secretary of State puts, as by law, puts us 7 days ahead. Democratic Party can't do anything about it. However, they could say, take away, they could penalize New Hampshire Democratic Party, which they overrule, and say, well, we're going to take away half your delegates, or even all your delegates, okay? Or they could penalize candidates running for their party's nomination. Like, we'll say, well, delegate penalties would be one way to do that. Or they could do something like, well, we're going to, any debates that we sponsor as a party in 2023, you can't participate in because you signed up for the New Hampshire primary. And that primary is in violation of our rules, et cetera, et cetera. So the party can do some things to sanction, but they can't control the party date. The state can hold a primary. The problem for New Hampshire, or New Hampshire Democrats in particular, is what if you have a primary and no one shows up? Okay, that's the dilemma, right? Now on the Republican side, let me be clear. The last hurrah thing is a bit exaggerated because Republican Party is perfectly fine with New Hampshire voting when it does, which is behind Iowa caucuses but ahead of South Carolina. Okay, they're fine with it. A fact that New Hampshire Republicans will be crowing about every day for the next, 12, 18 months, et cetera, right? But they're fine with it, which makes it even more unlikely that New Hampshire is about to change its first in the nation law, because Governor Sununu and New Hampshire Republicans, I understand why, say, hey, our party's fine with this. Why would we change our law because of what the Democrats want to do? Right? But Democrats obviously have issues, and these issues have been brewing for a while. Like I mentioned, like this, New Hampshire going first, there's been controversy about that dating back to the mid-70s, basically, for one reason or another. I would say, and I've thought this for a couple of years, that this is a challenge of a different order of magnitude than we've seen before. And I say that because it's no longer, one state versus another, wrestling with each other to be first. What we've seen emerge in the Democratic Party over the past couple decades is, well, look, we are a racially diverse party. Okay? We are much more racially diverse than the other party. Voters of color matter a lot to our coalition of voters. And that's that's not politics, that's demographics, which converts into politics. And so this issue of diversity has been raised up the flagpole again and again. That's why Nevada and South Carolina are where they are now, voting basically very close to New Hampshire. But we heard a lot of that in 2020, and so now you've got this case where basically it's New Hampshire going first versus a principle, versus just like, well, Arizona wants to go ahead of us, so they're no better than we are. It's blah, 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 blah. Now it's a little different. In addition, New Hampshire Democrats really put themselves, and now again, it's not all of them, right? Most New Hampshire Democrats did not vote for Bernie Sanders in 2020, right? Sanders won with, if I remember correctly, it was like in the high 20s, like 27%, give or take, of the vote. Like he won, but it was very close. Like Pete Buttigieg almost won. Amy Klobuchar did pretty well. So you can't blame a majority of Democrats. However, right, they put Joe Biden in 5th place, okay, and sent him packing, literally, right? Off he went before we even voted to South Carolina, which a lot of people smirked at, including me, I will admit, right? Because I really thought, okay, if Biden finishes 3rd in New Hampshire and Iowa, that would be okay. But if you 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire, he's done. I really thought he's done, but that didn't turn out that way. Basically, South Carolina turned around, Nevada first, right? Biden finishes 2nd, but then South Carolina, the South Carolina primary, South Carolina's Democrats African American voters in particular, basically saved Joe Biden's bid for the presidency. So Biden can turn around and tell Senator Shaheen and tell Senator Hassan, sorry, I don't owe you people anything, politically speaking. And you hear a lot of railing about Biden is rigging the process and putting South Carolina first. And so, yeah, okay, yes, he is. He's lining it up so his main political allies are front and center. South Carolina. That's totally true. I mean, Biden is saying it's about a principle, and he's not wrong. However, it also makes good political sense for Biden to do this. And that's why it's another order of magnitude different, because for the first time, we haven't seen this where a president wants to basically reshape the calendar, not just New Hampshire, but the whole calendar, as drastically as President Biden wants to do. Jimmy Carter did a little of this in the run-up to 1980, but this is more drastic, what Biden is doing. And so now you have, and again, he's the head of his party. What are National Democrats going to do, right? They're going to do what the incumbent president wants them to do. That's just how political parties work. And so now again, New Hampshire Democrats are in a position where, hey, a lot of times incumbents owe New Hampshire something. Like you think back to Bill Clinton in '92, right? He finishes second, he's the comeback kid, blah, 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 blah. And so there's this bond between an incumbent and New Hampshire, like as not. But not this time. Basically, they hung him out, New Hampshire Democrats hung him out to dry, but he came back. And he's not especially happy, with New Hampshire. So that's why I think that's why this is a serious, serious issue that I don't think is going away. And even if, and again, I think we're going to be in a position where I don't think President Biden will put his name on the ballot in New Hampshire. Right? Imagine that, right? The incumbent president of the United States will not appear on the Democratic primary ballot in New Hampshire in 2024. And at least as far as I understand the law, no one can put him there. Democrats could write him in, right? They could do what they did for Johnson back in '68, but they can't put him on unless, Biden basically says okay. So imagine that, right? Imagine if you had a primary where the president's not on the ballot, what's going to happen, right? And then we go forward to 2028. This is the issue for Democrats is, the Democrats are talking about looking over the calendar every 4 years. Well, where's New Hampshire going to go from here? Okay, it's not even clear that Democrats are going to authorize us voting second because National Democrats want us to put into place things like early voting. And I don't think early voting is going to happen in New Hampshire either. We have same-day voting, but early voting, the way other states do, that's not going to happen with this legislature and this governor. So we may even get pushed further back by the Democrats. So that's where things are, right now. And so where, Republicans, it's business as usual. Democrats could be, it might be a moot point because Biden may run and no one may oppose him, et cetera. But going forward, really we might be entering a very different era. Maybe for the nomination process as a whole, but certainly for the New Hampshire primary. So with that, I'll stop, and thanks for your attention, and happy to open it to questions.